Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Comedian MTG. No, it's just again. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. I went undefeated this weekend with Vivi, so let's get right into it. This brand new Final Fantasy Commander has a lot going for it, and we're going to talk about all those things here today. Before we do, if you like videos like this, make sure to hit that like button, that subscribe button. It helps out the channel a whole ton. And if you're interested in supporting the channel a little bit extra, head over to patreon.com/comedianmtg, where you can help support this wonderful channel we've got going on here. I've been talking with some folks over at Patreon about potentially adding some more shorts to the channel and polling a lot of my patrons about what they want to see in that type of content. So if you're interested in joining that discussion, head over to patreon.com/comedianmtg. Without any further ado, let's break down my Vivi list from last weekend that I used to go undefeated at the cEDH tournament. So as we mentioned, Vivi is a brand new Final Fantasy commander, and to understand why we're playing this commander as the lead of our deck, let's talk a little bit about it and read through its abilities. Vivi costs 1 a red and a blue. It's a little wizard, and it has the activated ability of add X mana in any combination of blue and or red, where X is Vivi's power. Activate only during your turn and only once each turn. So noticeably very bad at instant speed if you want to capitalize upon that mana ability for this card. It also has whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a 1/1 counter on Vivi Ornithea, and it deals 1 damage to each opponent or Ornithea. I'm not really 100% sure with the Final Fantasy pronunciations a lot of the time, but we are trying to use Vivi as an advantage engine in this deck and mostly capitalize on the fact that Vivi gets pretty broken with curiosity abilities. Now, the weird thing about Vivi as the commander of this list is that Vivi is really a big enabler in the list. It definitely helps to sort of push the game plan forward a little bit. And I found that, despite there's certain aspects of the deck that were, a little bit of ebb and flow about what is the higher priority, what is the most important aspects, I found that a lot of the times with keeping Vivi hands, it was really about picking and choosing your windows. It's about getting the ability to get those curiosity style effects and then find the correct window to stick those effects. Now, people are hearing me say curiosity style effects and not really sure what I'm referring to. I will show you right now based on the card Curiosity, which of course we do have redundancy of. There are multiple cards with this effect, but we're talking specifically about curiosity effects. They say when enchanted creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. Now, notably, as you can see, it does not say combat damage. So specifically, curiosity effects are allowing us to leverage the fact that Vivi pings every opponent for every non-creature spell and turn that into basically ancestral recalls, right? So we are now able to have multiple engines in our deck that just say, hey, we're going to stick a curiosity on these commanders, and now every single spell that we cast for the rest of the game is a draw 3, which is pretty good. For those who are unfamiliar with the play patterns, that's often what you are trying to do with this deck. So for redundancy, there is not only Curiosity, you also have Ophidian Eye, which is a flash, much more expensive version of that effect. Now, you'll notice that Ophidian Eye and Curiosity are also may effects, right? You may draw a card in these situations. Now we go to the worst version of these effects because it is not optional, and that's in Tandem Lookout. So for those who are trying to pick up this deck and pilot it for the first time, Tandem Lookout does come with a bit of risk because it is not a may. So you will end up in situations where if you are storming through your deck, you have to remove your Tandem Lookout before it gets too late so that you don't accidentally draw through your entire deck and kill yourself, which would be very bad. I definitely had that situation come up over the course of the games that I played this weekend. Very simply was just able to bounce my own Tandem Lookout in those moments, or, use a Red Blast, whatever it might be. At one point I just snapped it and then was able to keep going through my combo loops. And so Tandem Lookout, perfectly fine to be able to remove. Just notably, you want to be aware of that downside as a pile of the deck so your opponents aren't winning in situations where you should probably have won the game. The nice part about Tandem Lookout, however, is that it is a creature spell. So it being a creature spell, it being able to stick and soul bond with your commander while not putting any non-creatures on the stack is very valuable. There have been times over the course of playing this weekend and in testing with this deck where specifically my opponents were sitting there with things like Fierce Guardianship and cards like that, Force of Negation, etc., where Tandem Lookout's able to stick, and yes, they can counter the next spells you cast off of Vivi, but the draw 3 part is the bigger and scarier part of the engine that they should probably be dealing with. So the last of the curiosity style effects that I did end up putting in the deck is like a pseudo curiosity, and that's actually Virtue of Courage. While yes, it has this adventure side that is a 2 damage burn spell, it's mostly there for the enchantment side, which says whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, you may exile that many cards from the top of your library, and you may play those cards this turn. So significantly worse than a curiosity because you're not putting those cards in your hand, but you are exiling 3 for every spell you're casting with Vivi. Now, while this is a 5 mana version and a strictly worse version than the other ones in the deck, and I guess not technically strictly worse because this gets around Bowmasters. So while it is worse in a lot of departments, it does have the occasional upside. And at the end of the day, the mulligans with this deck can be really, really tough. So just having a 4th version of this effect is really effective, and it has come up, and it's basically created situations where, yeah, I could keep a hand around these other pieces, right? Allow myself to potentially go and search for the other curiosity effects. But worst case scenario, Virtue of Courage was a really solid backup plan that I had access to, which was nice a lot of the time. You may be looking at this deck and see resemblances to other Storm decks that have been around in the past. And it is worth noting that Vivi has a Storm plan that is accessible to it, right? The thing that you don't ever really want to end up in a situation. Oh, it's funny, Ral actually popped up here because Ral is in the 99 of this deck, and a lot of the card choices probably look pretty similar to Ral. And I think if you look at this deck and don't really take the time to analyze the play patterns, it might look like it is just a worst Ral deck, right? But that is really, really far from how this deck actually plays out. Now, while they do share similar cards, the way I tend to play Vivi is that it's much more a deck about picking and choosing your tempo, right? You are basically trying to, yes, gain passive advantage through a lot of these exiles, these cantrips effects, right? And it is nice to have all of these storm enablers in your deck so that when you start chaining draw 3, draw 3, draw 3, draw 3, you are basically able to actually capitalize upon it, right? You want to never end up in a situation in which you are playing a bunch of draw 3s and then going, okay, pass with 15 cards in hand and tapped out of interaction, right? Like that's the nightmare scenario for this deck, which is why we are still playing a bunch of the cards that you might associate with these more storm heavy Izzet decks. Now, you could also swap some of these out with things like more 0-drop mana rocks, right? More free ways to gain advantage. But the problem is if you just overload on those, your deck kind of does nothing if you are not having a curiosity effect on your commander, right? Whereas the way it is built currently, it is meant to still be able to, for example, use all of these cantrip spells, right? Reckless Impulse, Rob the Archive, Witch's Mark, all of these cards allow us to gain more and more card advantage. And one thing you might notice, especially when we talk about mulligans in this deck, is that the mulligans are really awkward. I'm a very aggressive mulliganer in cEDH. And to be honest, there were many times with this deck where I kept mulligan, and I found this happening more and more through the course of the tournament, where I was like, yeah, there's like a key piece of this strategy completely missing from this hand. And I'm very aware of that. And it's a very intentional choice because you can basically keep hands that have 80% of what you need and just expect to draw the 20% that you're missing if the math works out, right? So for example, if you're looking at a hand and it's all the mana you could ever need, but there's no curiosity style effects and you have no way to tutor it and you have no card advantage, that's obviously the ones that are unacceptable, right? But we're talking more about the case of, you might have a curiosity and a way to get Vivi out turn 2, but you don't have any spells that will allow you to attach the curiosity and start chaining spells together. That's a hand you can keep because you can allow yourself to find the right window to stick the curiosity, play those spells, move forward by just sticking Vivi and then being patient with pushing in any way. And that's the really interesting part about the deck, because I do sort of think that Vivi on its own, Vivi without a curiosity style effect, is not a kill on sight commander. I think it's pretty reasonable for your opponents to just let it chill. Like if they want to Gilded Drake it or Deadpool it or whatever because it's good for them, sure. But I don't think it's something that you should just like automatically Swords to Plowshares anytime you see it in a pod, because I don't think it really deserves that much aggressive respect, right? But the point in which is your opponent's interaction point is when you go to put those draw spells onto your commander, right? It's definitely something that can start to snowball rather aggressively. Now, you might notice that this deck, as I mentioned, is more proactively inclined, right? There are a few more rituals. There's a few more draw spells. As I mentioned, I believe that gives this deck more consistency than just having, for example, I've seen a bunch of mid-range versions of the deck that have a bunch of random big creatures like Hullbreaker Horror, or they're using Valley Floodcaller combos. And I just find that those are so antithetical to the way the deck plays when it's going off, that it was really hard for me to justify playing a bunch of cards that are just so not what the deck is doing in its best moments, right? I wanted to have opportunities for Vivi to push in the early game and be successful in doing so, right? A lot of the time I was winning with this deck, it was just my turn 3 was able to find a window to stick a Curiosity and then go and go and go and go. And, you know, obviously not every single time was I able to do that, right? But a lot of games actually did involve me just sort of playing a couple cards here and there, building up a little bit of advantage, waiting for a nice opportunity for myself to find a window, remove a key piece that might be stopping me, and then push when the window becomes available to me, right? And I really do think that is going to be anyone who wants to take this deck seriously, to take it into tournaments, all that kind of stuff. The really, really important parts of this game plan are going to be finding your windows, finding those moments where, because if you just stick a Curiosity on Vivi and your opponent's Swords to Plowshare it because you went for it when everyone had a bunch of interactions up, like that's kind of on you as a pilot. That is 100% something that will blow you out in those circumstances, right? And worth noting too, right? Curiosity plus Vivi really weaken to Bowmasters, like I mentioned beforehand. And it's, yeah, you can hypothetically draw 6 cards before, you know, your combo is over, but at some point you're probably in a little bit of trouble, right? Like it's if you notice I mentioned draw 6 in that situation, because by the time you're sticking a Curiosity, you've probably already had a Vivi trigger, obviously to increase the power of Vivi, and then the first time you are casting any spell, Vivi's toughness goes up to 4. So despite the fact that you're drawing 3 cards, 3 damage is all that will be dealt to Vivi as opposed to the 4 in total. And then obviously, hopefully speaking, you've played more spells beforehand to pump Vivi a little bit out of the range of just an instant Bowmaster kill. And obviously, speaking of, I did mention the 4 toughness thing before anyone writes down in the comments. Yes, I understand that Bowmasters can enter ping and then draw 3 ping, right, to deal 4 damage. But that's obviously the scenario we're trying to play around rather frequently with this deck. Gotta thank longtime sponsor of the channel now, Heavy Play. Heavy Play has been absolutely fantastic to work with. I reached out to them recently and they actually picked up a new brand of sleeves that are available on their website as well. But I love Heavy Play for their deck boxes and their full magnetic setup. I use their deck box with a magnetic dice tray and a playmat for my entire setup whenever I'm going to a cEDH tournament. I do not get paid by Heavy Play to go and rep their products, but I love their products. They reached out to me a long time ago and I said, oh my gosh, I thought you didn't work with people. I'm so excited to work with you guys because I genuinely love the product you create. They are super high quality deck boxes, super high quality and easy to use magnetic setup. I'm even grabbing a new Heavy Play box pretty soon just so I can use it to attach my tokens to a Heavy Play box. So it's all magnetically locked in one convenient location. Check out heavyplay.com. And if you use code comedian on your first purchase, you can get 10% off of your order. Heavyplay.com, and they have so many amazing products. They have the boxes that you see in front of you, the magnetic dice trays, the sleeves, stuff like that. But they also have things like deck box holders and new magnetic playmat tubes and a bunch of new products that you should check out on their website now. So one notable exclusion that you'll see in this deck, and that some people might find controversial, and I don't know if I think it's controversial after having played the deck because it didn't really come up a whole lot, but you won't see flash effects in this deck, right? There's no Valley Floodcaller. There's no Born Upon a Wind. And the reason for that is because of Vivi, right? Vivi does not thrive in those instant speed environments. Now, I know there's going to be concerns about certain things that could blow us out in situations, all that kind of stuff. And I do hear people when they're concerned about those things, right? But I find that in a lot of situations, you will find windows on your turn and be able to go off, and having access to Vivi's mana ability is really important to that game plan, which means that the deck thrives at sorcery speed. Do I think it's absolutely crazy to play any instant speed stuff in this deck? Absolutely not. I think many people will play this archetype and be able to play it in a way in which instant speed benefits are there in this deck. But as I mentioned, I wanted to keep the main game plan as consistent as possible, which is play small bits of advantage, get your commander out, find a good window, win the game, right? Much more focused on finding the right window for your deck and executing that window. Now, that being said, I mentioned I am not on any instant speed win effects. However, I am on Final Fortune in the deck. So either A, if we need an extra turn, right? You're sort of in the middle of the Vivv thing, you're getting a bunch of advantage, but maybe you're fizzling on mana. Final Fortune's really, really good at getting you to that next turn where you can then capitalize and start pushing once again, usually probably able to win the game in a Final Fortune turn. Plus, it also gives you opportunities, like many people know, for Final Fortune. If, for example, there's a big counterspell fight on somebody's turn, it's not like you can never win at instant speed. It's more like Final Fortune can insert a turn in those opportunities to get you to a place in which you can push and win in those moments. Also worth mentioning, this is an Underworld Breach deck. You can win with the Underworld Breach combos. In a lot of situations, your like Underworld Breach win in the deck is just casting enough spells with Breach so that Vivv just pings down the entire table. But importantly, Breach is important for how you win through a One Ring, right? That is a question I've gotten already on the deck list a couple times, is how do you win if your opponents have a copy of the One Ring, right? Because obviously, if your main way of winning the game would either be milling people out with Brain Freeze, which I don't ever recommend as a solution, but milling people out with Brain Freeze or attempting to ping them down with Vivi, right? How do you win if they have protection? And the answer is a very simple sorcery known as Witch's Mark that I sort of highlighted earlier, right? So what Witch's Mark says is you may discard a card if you do draw 2 cards, and then you create a Wicked Roll token attached to up to 1 target creature you control. Now, Wicked Rolls say if you control another roll on it, you put that one to the graveyard. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1, and when this aura is put into the graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life. So for those who are unfamiliar with the way rolls work, as I mentioned, if there's a roll already on it, it goes to the graveyard, meaning if you go to put another roll on a creature and it falls off, your opponents lose life. Now, losing life gets around protection. Damage gets stopped by protection, but losing life doesn't get stopped by protection. So in many situations, you're basically setting up a breach loop where you can cast the Witch's Mark over and over again. Now, that might sound daunting to some people because you might be asking, well, how do we have enough cards in our library to get up to 40 copies of Witch's Mark cast on a card? And the answer to that is through our other card here, Bonus Round. It says until the end of turn, whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, that player copies it and may choose new targets for the copy. So what you do first in many of these situations is you actually cast Bonus Round several times, right? So say you've cast Bonus Round like 4 times over the course of the game, right? First of all, you would see your first bonus round would copy the second bonus round. So by the time you cast a bonus round again, you now have 3 copies of bonus round active. And then I don't want to do the math on how many times it multiplies after that. But point being, by the next time you cast Witch's Mark, you're doing something like 8 copies of Witch's Mark, which is obviously a much faster way than just manually casting Witch's Mark 40 times out of your graveyard, right? So bonus round a bunch first, then Witch's Mark. You'll be able to kill people through the One Ring pretty easily. One combo that obviously is picked up from classic Storm aspects is the use of Past in Flames, and specifically being able to set it up with Intuition. When I was constructing the deck, I really went back and forth on like how relevant that was going to be, but there's a lot of situations in which you might be fizzling. Or for example, if you lose your Underworld Breach and you've just got this graveyard stocked full of instants and sorceries that's rituals and exile effects and more draw spells and a bunch of snaps and dramatic versals and all of those things, right? The graveyard does fill up pretty naturally over the course of playing this deck. But as I mentioned, the card draw really is the limitation of Vivv. And so Past in Flames is basically this aspect of the deck that allows you to have any sort of play, any sort of agency if things have gone wrong, right? It's a really good way to basically give yourself some sort of play when things are falling apart. I've also, for example, I had a game during the course of this tournament where I was able to intuition. I went and grabbed Past in Flames in my graveyard, one instant and sorcery that I wanted to cast. I can't remember what it was for the life of me at this point. But then I also grabbed the removal spell, right? So I used the removal spell to get rid of a problematic creature. And then I was able to go into my turn with Past in Flames and something that I wanted in the yard. And yes, it is an expensive mana investment, right? Past in Flames is 5 mana to be flashed back, but kind of the whole point of this commander is that Vivi makes a ton of mana, and the card draw point, once again, is that choke point. So if you've been playing the game plan right and building up sort of passive triggers on Vivi to get it up to a reasonable mana ritual, then you should be in a pretty decent spot. Really want to shout out staple of this deck, Light Up the Stage. Really cool interaction with this commander. Basically, if you cast any other spell during the course of your turn, it probably means that Vivi has pinged your opponents, meaning the spectacle cost, the reduced cost, is online, right? So basically, Spectacle says whenever you have, if an opponent has lost life this turn, you can pay for the spectacle cost. So if you played any spell, then you play Light Up the Stage. It only costs 1 red, and then it allows you to exile the top 2 cards. So that's a fun little synergy here. I really wanted to shout out Stock Up as well. It's a card that I was really excited about adding to the deck. I know a lot of instant and sorcery based decks, things like Rogsai, a lot of decks like that have been picking up Stock Up because, first of all, it's just like sort of a reduced dig through time without the downside of having to remove cards from your graveyard. Obviously, us being a Past in Flames deck does not mean we want to be a dig through time, delving away our graveyard type of deck, right? So Stock Up was really, really solid in a number of different situations, mostly in goldfishing. I didn't see it a ton during the course of the tournament, but it's fixed a lot of hands, made a lot of hands less awkward. I think I resolved it once during tournament, and it definitely just like at one point gets me like a land and then a piece I need to follow up, whether it's Curiosity or a spell to follow up after the Curiosity style effect, right? If you've been watching these videos for any amount of time, you know that I am a huge fan of ToaMagic.com. Tales of Adventure has a ridiculous inventory of eternal cards. That is why their slogan is Eternal Lives Here. And as cEDH players, we need a lot of cards that have been spanning the entire course of Magic. Most of the entirety of Magic is legal in our format, and you need to pick up those singles at a great price. So ToaMagic.com, you can use code Comedian to get 5% off your order. They have super fast shipping, and if you're heading out to MagicCon in the next few weeks or any of the major events, you will often find a Toa Magic booth there, and you can order online and pick up at location, which is a super convenient service that Toa offers. Once again, if you use code Comedian at checkout, you can get 5% off your order. ToaMagic.com. Check it out now. So now I think we'll go from card type to card type and talk about any highlight cards. As I mentioned, Ral was really, really helpful, just being a, Goblin Electromancer style effect that occasionally can be a little bit more card advantage, right? Occasionally you will want to flip to the backside of Ral and use its -8 ability. But realistically, in many of these circumstances, I was just able to play Ral, have a body that was ready to be sacrificed if I needed it to, and just have the ability to potentially have a better VV turn moving forward. It isn't necessary to have an effect like that in the deck. And if anything, like if I could have 2 Ruby medallions, I probably would have those instead, because I also like reducing the cost of my other cards that aren't just instants and sorceries. But all in all, Ral was decent enough and put in, as I mentioned, a decent amount of work. Bergie is in much the same camp. Sometimes Bergie is card advantage, and I have found that a lot of folks who tend to underestimate Bergie tend to not think about the Harnfell Hornibindi sound of this card. I think this card is actually quite very good at producing a lot of card advantage, but also in a deck where, for example, there will be times where you'll have to activate Vivi too early in the turn for you to be able to pop off, Bergie will be able to save you in a lot of those circumstances. I've also had times where I was able to play Bergie first and then follow up with Vivi, and then the mana I was passively getting off of Bergie was able to actually propel me towards playing a much more manual Storm style game plan, as opposed to the, resolve the Curiosity, pop off from there style game plan. Now, it is important to know, like, you may see the fact that I'm on certain blue cantrips in this deck and prioritize red cantrips over those in a lot of situations, right? Like normally I'm a big faithless looting hater in the deck, in most decks, to be honest. But the thing is that you have to recognize with this archetype is that when you are playing Izzet Storm specifically, or not that this deck is officially Izzet Storm, right? Like I think it's much more Izzet Tempo-y, but with a Storm foundation to it, right? And when you play these Storm Foundation style archetypes, you have to account for the fact that you make a lot of red mana. You make a lot of red mana in these circumstances, right? If you look at Bergie, if you look at Rite of Flame, we're on Jeska's Will, we are on Desperate Ritual, you're on Pyretic Ritual, you're on Seething Song, right? So you have a lot of ways to produce situations where you go from a little bit of red mana to a lot of red mana. And your quickest way to make a lot of blue mana is to use Vivv's activated ability, but we want to take pressure off the deck to make it so that you don't have to activate Vivv's ability earlier in the turn, because the deck gets infinitely better the longer you can wait to activate Vivv, right? When you use Vivv early on in the turn to make like 3 mana, it probably will put in a decent amount of work. However, if you think about the times in which you can activate Vivv and then all of a sudden it's making 10, 11 mana, that's really when the card starts to shine. And really when it starts to feel kind of ludicrous, right? Gotta shout out Displacement Wave in a deck like this where, you know, looking at a bunch of Ristics, looking at a bunch of Mystics, looking at Bowmasters, looking at, you know, a lot of things that can be disruptive, permanent based things. Displacement Wave is a really nice way to just say, like, put 2 mana into it, pick everything back up, right? And the cool part about Displacement Wave is several times, not only during the course of this tournament, as I said, but during testing, I was able to Displacement Wave for 0, pick up like all of my fast mana, right? And then just replay them all again. And those were all, you know, X amount of Vivv triggers were X of the amount of cards that I just picked up from that situation, right? So it's a really quick way to like reverse fizzle. I really do think if you go to pick up this deck, I advise playing it as is for the time being, just because there are a lot of cards that may seem a little out of place until you get a chance to play them, right? Like even looking at these cantrips are considered outdated in a lot of situations, but they just fix so many opening hands, and opening hands are a real problem with the deck. And I think it's where a lot of the mastery of the deck comes from, is like knowing what opening hands to keep. But Ponder, Preordain, cards like that, like the Faithless Looting, they all really, really help in situations in which your opening hand is like most of the way there, like I mentioned earlier, but not 100%. I'm assuming people are going to ask me about Time Twister. Time Twister is a convenience piece. I don't love shuffling my graveyard away in a deck that plays Past in Flames and plays Underworld Breach, but it's also a deck that respects the fact that you could lose those cards at any time as well, and so you can shuffle that back in. Could you swap this out for a Windfall? Absolutely, you could, especially if you're playing in a non-proxy environment. I understand a $3,000 convenient card is not worth it for a lot of people. No, I would not play Echo of Eons in its place. I would just probably play Windfall if I'm going to swap that out for another wheel style effect. E-Instance shouldn't really have a lot of surprises here. Dizzy Spell is a card that allows you to go and tutor up Curiosity for 1 and 2 blue. I hate that we have to play Dizzy Spell. I do accept that we have to play Dizzy Spell. I'm unhappy with it, but it does feel like a necessary evil at times, and having an instant, which is a very acquirable card type, go and grab us our Curiosity style effects is very powerful. Now you might notice I'm not on Mystical Tutor. I found that card was actually fizzling me too much when I was during my storm turns, because I was giving up my draws to put the right instant and sorcery on top of my library, and I found that a lot of the cards that just put cards in my hand were going to be better for me in those situations, which I'm aware there are downsides to that mentality. But Pyroblast, Red Elemental Blast, I think if you're going to play this deck, you want more proactive counterspells, right? Counterspells that you can use during your turn if you need to. So firing off a Red Blast or a Pyroblast on random spells does help you. For example, if you have Vivv plus Curiosity effect, or even if you're just using Vivv for mana, it helps to be able to use your spare red mana to be able to blow something up. Now, obviously, they're awesome if there's a Rhystic or a Mystic Remora on the battlefield, but they're even better to just have as ways to, you know, for example, Curiosity effect, you don't have any other spells in hand, you can target literally a land with Pyroblast, and no, it won't blow up the land, but it'll be a spell that you cast that allows you to dive deeper. I am not a big Daze fan in general. In a deck like this where every mana counts, Daze is great. Sometimes you just need the free counter spell. And worst case scenario too, if you're like storming off, you can always Daze your own spell to get another spell cast, which is funny if you really don't need the spell. And that comes up. Same thing with Offer You Can't Refuse. I can't tell you how many times I've been playing a storm deck where I go to put a spell that I don't care about on the stack, and then I go to offer it to just get my mana back. It helps, and it will come in handy at times. And once again, 2 spell casts in that situation there too. Is this the best Dramatic Reversal deck in the world? Absolutely not. Am I playing Isochron Scepter to go infinite with Dramatic Reversal? No, Isochron Scepter is a pretty bad card. Could you do that? Sure, I guess. Dramatic Reversal is just in here because it's a great Storm card. I play it there for just that reason. You play a lot of mana rocks. Untapping all of them is pretty decent. Could you, as I said, play the Isochron Scepter thing? Yeah, you definitely could. The card quality of Isochron Scepter as a card definitely bums me out, but I've definitely heard of worse strategies, and sometimes a clean win is a clean win. You know, there's arguments about whether Isochron Scepter is a clean win, especially in a world where people play Beseiju all the time. Yeah, it's a tough question, right? I want to shout out one of our sponsors here on today's episode, Pool Priority. So this is actually a tournament that is going to be happening over this summer on July 12th. It is a cEDH foil Gaia's Cradle tournament. So it's going to be a pretty sweet tournament. I will have the link of this tourney in the description down below this video, but $50 entry in July 12th, and it will be in Columbia, Nashville Highway, Columbia, Tennessee. And if you're curious about any of those details, as I mentioned, you can find it in the link down below. Here is the pricing for this event, and all of the details I mentioned. Find it in Columbia, Tennessee, this July 12th. Pool Priority, a part of the Landgo Summer Circuit, and a Top Deck Gold event if any of those details are interesting to you. So come check it out. Really interesting event. Also, you might notice that some of the more traditional counterspells are not in this deck, right? Things like Force of Negation and Mindbreak Trap. As I mentioned, this is a pretty proactive deck, right? It sucks when you're in the middle of storming off and you draw a Force of Negation or a Mindbreak Trap, right? It's much better for defensive purposes. And don't get me wrong, we still have a decent amount of defensive interaction, right? But I don't want to over invest in that defensive interaction. Hence why we have a much more specifically selected things, right? Like Daze is a card that you play over Mindbreak Trap if you're trying to win in smaller and earlier windows, right? Submerge is a really interesting one. There are going to be games. So fun fact, this was gut shot until the night before the tournament. And I said, I've been fluctuating between them, but I think Submerge is just a more responsible card. It's a card that is more likely to deal with more cards, right? Like Gutshot deals with Orcish Bowmasters, which I already mentioned is a giant pain in the butt for this deck. But Submerge has the opportunity to actually deal with real problems. Also, Drannith Magistrate, Opposition Agent, right? Not that we care about Oppo that much, to be honest, but cards that traditionally can be a bit of a pain in the butt for us. Ranger Captain is also another one that Submerge specifically hits, which did come up multiple times over the course of this tournament. Someone had a Ranger Captain and I was able to end step Submerge, get rid of the Ranger Captain so that I could go off on my turn, which is great. Yeah, I wanted to be doing that as much as possible. Yeah, we already kind of went over the benefits of Intuition. It's mostly in there for the Past in Flames pile. It is also nice that at some point Intuition can just give you 3 curiosity effects, right? You can just go like Curiosity, Ophidian Eye, Tandem Lookout. And it's, you know, one of the awkward things that prevents this deck from being like kind of scary as far as like good decks in the format, right? I think, you know, early on people were comparing it to like Nadu, right? And which I think is a very preposterous comparison. But the comparison of those definitely came out of the fact that like Nadu, and one of the reasons it falls flat, I should say, is that Nadu has a lot of ways to tutor the pieces that were combo pieces, right? Like you could Urza Saga for Shuko, you could use Fabricate or Transmute Artifact, or like a dozen different ways to go grab pieces that allowed you to super Nadu tutor. Also, the fact that Nadu inherently had card advantage and Vivi doesn't is like such a big comparison there that like it's sort of just not even close. But the nice part is Intuition does allow you for one moment to, yes, at the sacrifice of entombing your other 2 curiosity effects, it does allow you to tutor a curiosity effect if you are desperate. So Intuition is definitely at least somewhat decent at doing that as well. Yeah, for those who know me, they know I love Jeweled Amulet. It is one of the best bad cards in the format. The reason it's acceptable here is because it gets you turn 2 Vivi in 99% of circumstances. If you have 2 lands, you play it turn 1, charge it turn 2, play Vivi turn 3. Or sorry, play it turn 1, charge it turn 1, play Vivi turn 2. That's what I meant. There's a couple other zeros in here. The hope is that you can string some 0 rocks together when you eventually stick a Curiosity on Vivi, because it gets very powerful when you do that, right? It's a really good way to gain a lot of advantage for literally no investment. But obviously, as I mentioned earlier in the video, you don't want to over invest in a bunch of 0 drop rocks, because they don't do anything otherwise, and that's bad. Now, these ones all in particular do have a job, right? Mishra's Bauble is an early Vivv trigger, but I used it several times over the course of the tournament to peek at the top card of an opponent's deck and dig myself further so that I could potentially get a piece I was missing for any specific combo turns. Paradise Mantle, I equipped not only to Vivv, but to other spare creatures like my Dragon Rage Channeler, my Ral, stuff like that over the course of the tournament. And it did come up that it was able to not only give me Vivv triggers, but produce mana. Paradise Mantle, I think, is the worst of these effects, but there were times where I was able to, for example, if I had my commander or another creature without Summoning Sickness, play it off of red mana, or equip it off of red mana, I should say, and then tap for blue mana, right? Little upsides there. Springleaf Drum is just a better version of that effect, but it does a very similar thing, right? It's the turn you play it, it's net neutral, right? You play it and you tap it, and it costs 1 mana, makes 1 mana. But going forward, it also is just making you mana. As I mentioned, Ruby Medallion was a card I liked quite a lot. It was just really convenient to have it at most times. Making Vivv cost 2 set you up for a lot of scenarios in which you weren't basically overextending into removal, right? You don't have situations where you're just like, all right, first removal spell and I die, right? So Ruby Medallion helps you sort of sequence that way. I do think Vexing Bauble was solid. I played this over Defense Grid very intentionally. Yes, we have access to SWAT and Guardianship and Force of Will and Pact and all of those things, right? But Bauble is just solid at 1, being a cantrip with Vivv, right? You play it and it immediately gets you a Vivv trigger. But also, unlike Defense Grid and stuff like that, it didn't feel like I had to over invest into that type of protection, right? Now, could this be Defense Grid? Absolutely. Could I see a reality where Bauble and Defense Grid are swapped and it doesn't make a difference in the deck and they sort of perform the same function? Yeah. Can I see situations where Defense Grid is better? Absolutely. I just liked in testing that I didn't have to overcommit with Vexing Bauble, where Defense Grid has times where you really get blown out by using Defense Grid, and then you pass to somebody who just has a protected turn now, The One Ring is awesome. All the card draw effects that you can play that are outside of Vivv are great because they relieve the pressure of your commander, right? A lot of the times, as I mentioned, I think newer pilots are going to get trapped in scenarios where they just try to play Vivv and jam Curiosity at the first available window and probably get blown out in a lot of situations. But I think like having your Mystic Remorse, heuristic studies, stuff like that, and then playing a medium speed Vivv plan and allowing your deck to basically allow you to play more of a mid-range game is a really solid thing that we have access to. And so I'm very glad that we have these options. It's even why I'm playing Mirror Maid in the deck. It was just a concession to the fact that, once again, like there are a lot of mid-range decks in the format right now, and I don't mind playing a mid-range game plan because Vivv does provide a solid value if you play that plan, right? It's not the plan the deck thrives with. The deck wants to be a faster deck, but if you have to, you can play mid-range. 25 lands. This is the least lands I think I've registered in a really long time. I think this is how many lands my Rogside deck was playing. So here's the weird thing with this land count, right? I think it is objectively correct, and it's going to feel bad at times. There are going to be times where you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I don't have another land drop. I'm so out of this game, et cetera, right? But there are going to be times where you are, for example, your main game plan relies on you stringing a bunch of cantrips together, right? Your Reckless Impulses are drawing you 2, your Rob of the Archives is drawing you 2 to 4, your Witch's Mark is drawing you 2, right? All of these cards, you're investing 1 card to look 2 cards deeper in many of these circumstances. Now, the nice part about these impulse draws is that you basically get 2 turns with them, right? But the bad side is that this information is revealed, but also that it's only getting you 2 cards. It's only allowing you to look at 2 cards. And in those situations, a lot of the time, those 2 cards need to put in a lot of work. And so if you have something like 28 to 30 lands in the deck, there's many times where you fire off your Reckless Impulses and your Ren's Resolves, your Witch's Marks, etc., and flood like crazy. This is something I was practicing a lot during gold fishing, and I think I started with 28 lands and just kept going down and down and down and down. And over the course of the tournament, there were times that I was missing land drops, but realistically, when I needed them, I was finding them in most circumstances. And the best part about all of these cantrips is like, you don't have to sandbag these all until you have Vivv. There were several times where, for example, I would have like turn 1 Chrome Mox, and I would go like, great, turn 1 Reckless Impulse, right? Maybe see if I can find my land drop for next turn. See if I have a spell I want to play instead of Vivv for turn 2, right? There was many times where they just smoothed out the opening hands and didn't need to play them like like you would in RAL, where you just, wait and just sandbag and then go like storm. In this situation, straight up, they were just draw twos that gave me better looks at future cards, right? Now, it does suck if you're in a Mystic Remora pod and a Ristic heavy pod. And that did come up during the course of some of these games, right? Where I would just be like, all right, cool. Every chance I have to keep playing the game, I have to be triggering these cards to look deeper. And that does suck when those come up. But in more situations that I was happy with than unhappy with, they were able to just give me a few cards deeper, allow me to give myself more options, and then look to make more educated and better plays as the game went on. Also, if you notice, I'm on Great Furnace and Seed of the Synod, 2 artifact lands. It was kind of free to throw those in, and it makes my Mox Opal a lot less awkward in the early game. And as mentioned, opening hands can be a bit of a struggle with this deck, so any opportunity I can make my opening a little less awkward, I will be doing so. All right, and last thing I want to do is show you some of these opening hands, because I know I've talked a lot about them over the course of this video, but I want to give you some context to what I've been yapping about. So as I mentioned, I did win this tournament and go undefeated with this deck at the King's Court 2K last weekend. And if you're curious on getting some of those skills, if you're curious on taking your cEDH game to the next level, you can reach me at comedianmtg@gmail.com is the easiest way to find me, or at any of the places in my link tree that should be down below this video. If you're curious about taking that next step up in your cEDH game, I have more wins on different decks and different archetypes than any player in the space. And my constant goal is to push the boundaries on what is playable in cEDH. There are so many Final Fantasy commanders that are here and ready to be explored, ready to be tinkered with, ready to be messed with. And if you're curious about brewing those, or just working on some of the fundamentals for your cEDH gameplay, if you're curious about someone who's a very seasoned tournament player, hit me up at comedianmtg@gmail.com or any of the places in the link tree down below. So the way I always do these, and especially when I'm doing them during coaching sessions, is what I'll often do is say, okay, we'll start in first seat and then we'll move backwards, right? So, for those who know me, they know I don't always love turn one relying on Mystic Remora hands. However, a hand that starts with the turn one Mystic Remora in first seat is often one that is a lot more attractive, right? Plus, we have 3 lands in a 25 land deck here. We also have, for example, if your Mystic Remora gets mental misstepped or countered in some way, you do have Ristic Study as a backup plan for this deck, for this hand. This is a very Vivv agnostic hand, but it's a hand that can illustrate one play pattern of the deck, which is, just doing the traditional mid-range thing of leaning on cards like Mystic and Ristic. So that's probably a keeper. Moving into second seat. So this one's not bad either. I'm not gonna lie. The plan here would probably be, and I think where some folks would maybe get a little over eager, is to just start jamming a bunch of spells turn one, right? In this situation here, I mean, obviously you're gonna play some spells, but it's basically gonna be your artifacts. And there's even a world where I actually hold on to that Lotus Petal here, right? Because that is a future Vivv trigger, right? Definitely something weird about this archetype is choosing spells to sandbag with Vivv. Obviously, when you're on your Vivv turns, you play into the Mindbreak Trap a little bit more often, but at the same time, the spells you're casting aren't always Mindbreak Trappable, so it's kind of okay, But in this situation here, even ignoring our draw for turn, definitely want to just get our acceleration out. I'm willing to fully tap out for Vivv next turn because, as I mentioned, I don't really think that Vivv is a kill on site commander until you're doing something that is worth killing, right? So for example, if on turn 3, I resolve a bonus round, or I put a bonus round on the stack with a Vivv on the field, sure, I understand why my opponents would be concerned at that moment, right? But just playing Vivv in general, I don't necessarily know that that's, immediately got to eat a Swords to Plowshares, right? Now, once again, if you have a Gilded Drake, if you have a Volatile Storm Drake, if you have a Deadpool, if you have some sort of control exchange effect, I totally get taking a Vivv. It's a really good engine. That's not really what I'm talking about, though. Cool. So in this situation here, let's yeah, I mean, that's just a solid hand, right? In the turn that I would be wanting to go off, once again, if we're ignoring what our hand is drawing here, I'm once again setting up for this turn 2 with Vivv. Now you can probably play the Lotus Petal on this turn just because you can get the free trigger here and kind of move on with your day, while also holding up a mana. Now it would be very easy to just go, great, let's pop off the light up the stage, but then you're only having one colorless mana floating and you have to pop Vivi super early. And this is what I mean. I think it's very easy to get over eager with Vivi, right? Whereas the next turn, if we untap, you can then use that Lotus Petal to be the second red source for bonus round, and you can start doing some crazy stuff there. Obviously, we're choked on red a little bit, but we've ignored the first 3 turns of draws, so that's obviously going to affect how this hand plays out quite a lot, because drawing your cards allows you to know how the hand actually plays. All right, so now we're looking at a hand in third seat, and I'm glad that it's not just an instant keeper, but this is also not a subtle hand. This is just an unkeepable pile of garbage. It's just an ancient tomb with a bunch of colored cards and no way to cast them. So yeah, we're going to ship that away. All right, now looking at wow, this deck is really just giving us gas here. Yeah, sure, okay. So let's talk about this a little bit. You're definitely pitching the City of Traders to the Mox Diamond. You don't want to keep a hand based on a land that you will eventually lose that also causes you to go down a land, right? And we want our colored sources for our turns that we're trying to do something, right? Now, this is our first Curiosity hand. Obviously, as I mentioned, these cards are very powerful and your opponents are right to be scared of them. So you've got to pick your window appropriately, right? Now, turn 1, obviously we can get a lot of stuff going. We can get the Mox Diamond down, you get the Island, get the Soul Ring. You're not playing this Tandem Lookout. I cannot stress that enough. Because even if your argument is, well, Ian, next turn I can play Vivi and they'll be soulbound, great. There's no follow-up spell. You do not want to overcommit to these cards at this point. Now, if you make the argument here that you want to play Strike It Rich, sure, I can get behind that. Strike It Rich at least gives you a treasure so that potentially you can do some crazy stuff when you put Vivi on the battlefield next turn, but then you have no cards that follow up playing Tandem Lookout later on, right? So, if we're not including the 3 mana to make 1 treasure as a flashback cost of Strike It Rich, which I am not currently referring to. So the idea would be play these turn 1, right? Turn 2, get our Vivi down. And then a lot of it does come to pod context at this point, right? It depends on what we think we're able to do, right? If we're sort of looking at a situation here in which, we don't really have a good window for Tandem Lookout, we're probably just hanging out. And that's something that I think pilots kind of have to get used to with this deck is like, there is going to be times. Now, this hand is kind of all in, right? As I mentioned, because as I mentioned with Vivi, you have to keep 80% hands at sometimes, right? This deck has everything you want except for something to do if you don't have the ability to pop off, right? So what I'm hoping for in this circumstance is one of the dozen plus draw engines that we have in the deck. And by draw engines, I don't necessarily mean Rhystic, Mystic, One Ring. I mean, I could be referring to my cantrips here, right? My Ren's Resolves, my Rob the Archives, my Strike It Riches, or not Strike It Rich, pardon me. But cards like that, the cards that, exile 2 cards, draw 2 cards, etc., right? I want to be looking for some of these cards that are either A, if my opponents give me an open window, allowing me to go Vivi, Tandem Lookout, combo, or B, I want to be looking for cards that are going to allow me to still play Magic if I don't have a good opportunity to play the Tandem Lookout. I cannot stress enough with this deck how deadly it is to just try and jam Vivi and a Curiosity effect if it's a bad window. It will get you killed. There is some exceptions to that rule, right? There are some times where you kind of have to negotiate with the table to allow you to, for example, stick a Vivi, stick a Curiosity, and trigger once or twice because, for example, there is a player who is out of control in the pod, right? I've had pods with this deck where, and usually not pods where I was winning, but usually pods where I was ended up getting forced into a draw where I did have to resolve a Curiosity effect and just play 2 spells because there was something stopping me, but there's also a person who is clearly like gaining a ton of advantage and I want to be able to sit there with interaction and cards in hand. And so I've had to make deals before where I'd be like, cool, I'll stick the Tandem Lookout, but or the Curiosity or whatever it is, but I'm only going to ever play 2 spells this turn and pass, right? And yeah, you can find windows of opportunity there where you can go like, oh, well, now every time you interact, that's even more cards and stuff like that, right? But once again, you're still susceptible to Rhystic Study, you're still susceptible to Bowmasters, you're susceptible to any piece of targeted removal. If your opponents really want to blow you out of the water and you can play the mid-range game, like they can blow you out of the water in those circumstances, right? So there is a little bit of like social discussion that can happen with this commander. And for example, my round 1 in the tournament, I was able to force a draw because there was a person who was like miles and miles ahead, and I was in a situation where there was a Bowmasters. I was just drawing enough cards to try and get some interaction. I was willing to let Vivi die after I drew some spells. But then we got to a point where I could keep pushing when that person had a win, that person had a win. There was like 3 pieces of interaction that would stop me. I didn't even really want to push in that circumstance. I just wanted to dig for more card draw because we were still dying and I didn't have enough interaction to actually keep us alive, right? So there's definitely situations there, as I said, where you can sort of navigate those discussions. And that situation became a situation where I was like, either A, we just pass and lose to the person who's in a really dominant position, or B, I can talk with this person who's next to me, who's willing to allow me to stick a curiosity and then get a little bit of advantage so that we can basically force a more defensive scenario. Not always even just force a draw, but more so force a scenario where we can have a balance to the table where we can, basically go around and play appropriately, Okay. This one is pretty rough. We have a curiosity effect in Virtue of Courage, but it's 5 mana and we only have 1 land in Ragavan. This is a hand that I would say is really keeping like 65% of what we want, right? And on a first 7, I probably wouldn't keep it, but if we're down to like a 5, I'm probably more interested in it because at least you can sort of scrap things together by like playing Dragon Rage Channeler and then like playing spells so that you're surveilling and fixing your draws. But this hand is super, super messy, super, super clunky, and I would keep it maybe like, as I said, on a 4 or a 5, but no sooner. 1 land gemstones hands I have kept before, but usually when they have more stuff to do. You have Springleaf Drum here, but if you never play a creature, it doesn't matter. You have Springleaf Drum, doesn't produce any mana. So I think this hand's kind of a big old trap. So let's go to a 6 here, and I believe we're in 3rd or 4th seed. I can't remember. Sorry. Okay, and now this hand. Ooh, this hand is also potentially a trap. So I'm going to pause for 2 seconds to see if you at home can identify what's wrong with this hand. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Great. So yes, this is an early Vivv potential, right? This is a hand in which we have a lot of mana. Great. But what is the one thing that Vivv lacks? Card draw. Now, I don't necessarily think in most pods, you can keep a hand with Mirror Maid and just assume it's going to draw you the right card draw pieces, right? You cannot just assume your opponents are going to have the Rhystic on turn 2. You cannot just assume they're going to have the Mystic Remora on turn 2. You cannot just assume they're going to have the One Ring. It is a possibility, which is a reason I could see someone between the possibility of top decking something we need and the possibility of Mirror Maid being able to copy something we need. I can see justifying keeping this hand. But I cannot stress enough for anyone interested in piloting this deck, do not keep hands that rely on the top deck for card draw. You will lose those games. You will lose those games. You have to keep hands that have some sort of forward momentum to them. If they don't, you will fizzle. You will top deck random rituals for 5 turns and you will lose the game. Don't do it. So this one's technically potentially keepable. Let's look at one final hand and we'll go back to first seed as we do so. Now, here's where I challenge the very thing that I was just saying. Does Dragon Rage Channeler surveilling on our non-creature spells count as card advantage? It counts as some sort of card selection, and the mana available in this hand could potentially justify keeping this hand. It would be risky, and I would be very nervous to do so on a first 7. Now, me just goldfishing here without stakes, not being in a tournament, I'm more interested to see how this hand goes. If I'm in a top 16 pod, if I'm in a win in Swiss, or if I'm in a top 4, I'm not keeping this hand because this is a hand that brings your chances in this tournament to fate and fate alone. And on a first 7, I don't really think that's acceptable. So let's move on. No colored sources, very colored hand. This is garbage. 6 here. That's a weirdie. That's definitely a weirdie. I think this is unkeepable because you're really relying on Mishra's Bauble to draw you anything here. You don't have 3 mana to get Vivi. Mox Amber is useless until you have Vivi, or you'd have to very luckily top deck a Ragavan or a Ral here, which is not something you should be keeping hands around ever. And then your only source of card advantage is Time Twister, which is great in a hand which you already have a couple free Vivi triggers, but this isn't happening until like turn 4, which is pretty unacceptable. So got to ship that away. Okay, this is our 5. Okay. And this is another hand that I'm kind of okay keeping what is not a great hand, because it's an acceptable hand, right? I probably think we have to throw back the pieces of interaction because you just need your deck to function. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, that sometimes means being greedy. Start out with just turn 1, strike it rich, get a treasure. Turn 2, play your Vivi. Turn 3, try and look at some cards with Embrace the Unknown. It's not a great plan, but it's a plan, right? And unfortunately, sometimes that is how you have to play hands with this deck. As I mentioned, the mulligans are always a point of contention with this list. And this is one of those hands that I don't think on a 5 you can throw away, but I'm not happy about keeping either. That is the Tiny Ping King. Last thing I'll mention, you may have noticed that I haven't mentioned any Surveil lands in the deck. Being on a 25 land deck and being a deck where I think every mana counts, as I've mentioned multiple times, I don't like Surveil lands, and I don't think keeping hands around turn 1 Surveil lands are smart. And I've had games with this deck where I don't do anything turn 1 because I have a really impactful turn 2, where I could easily have a Surveil land. But I've also kept track during Storm and during turns that I am executing wins when I'm goldfishing, where drawing an untapped land in those situations for lands that I hypothetically would have switched with the Surveil land, drawing a Surveil land would have killed me in those situations too, right? So I'm being very cognizant of the fact that, yes, the Surveil lands do have upside, but I'm intentionally choosing not to play them, even though there are situations where, as I said, they would come up in this deck. I just want to throw that out there before we wrap things up. So what do I think of Vivi? I think what I think of Vivi is still how I think the description is here. Overhyped, but very, very fun. I had a blast playing this deck. I do think Vivi is very clearly a cEDH commander. I don't think you go undefeated, even no matter how your play skill is with a deck, if the deck isn't, at least on some level, pretty decent, right? Super happy to have gone undefeated and win with the first legal Final Fantasy weekend with this Final Fantasy commander. It was a lot of fun to play. I can easily see myself still playing Vivi because, I mean, generally speaking, I'm an Izzet guy, right? So being able to play an Izzet commander has been something I have been really frustrated about with the format for quite some time, where, yes, there's been decks like Ral, which I've been slowly basically building up momentum to playing. I did play it at the Redemption event in Salt Lake City, so that's a deck I really enjoy, but it's very much traditional aggro Storm, right? And so it's nice to have a flexible Izzet commander that's not something like Niv Mizzet for the first time in a really long time. I really like the play patterns of Vivi. I really think it's fun, but I can't stress enough, it's a deck where you can play this deck really irresponsibly and it will look very bad. So you've really got to pick and choose your windows. You've got to choose when to push with your deck, and you've got to make really intentional choices with the composition of the 99 of this list. Do I think Vivi has some aggressive hype going into the set release? Yeah, I think on a very basic level, it looks like a broken design, right? But the lack of card advantage, I think, keeps it from being like insane to where people, as I mentioned, were comparing it to things like Nadi, which I do not think it is comparable to. I do think, however, it is a really cool card with, yes, hard to tutor, but multiple win conditions that are able to basically turn every spell into an Ancestral Recall, which is disturbingly powerful as far as effects are concerned, right? So Vivi is super solid, and that's what I really like about it. I think this is a deck, as I mentioned, I will be playing more often. I don't know that like the next 10K rolls around, I'm going to confidently walk in with my Vivi in my deck box, but I also don't know that that's not the case either, right? It's definitely a deck I want to experiment with more, play with more. And as I mentioned, there is many different Vivis running around, right? While not many people have sleeved them up and won with them right away, There's Hullbreaker versions of Vivi running around. There's infinite cast versions, things with Isochron Scepter. There's things with, I've seen the Dragonstorm Vivi variant. For those who know me pretty well, they know I was on a big Dragonstorm kick earlier this year, but I chose not to because basically what I was finding was the way I had it built currently, every time I drew the dragons, I was like, okay, I actually don't need these. And if anything, they're just dead draws, right? So for a little bit of background there. But, you know, there's plenty of versions of this deck that are available. I'm curious to hear people's thoughts down below. I'm curious to hear what people think of the commander, if they've seen it in the wild, if they're seeing it and they've been excited about it, they've been nervous about it, all that kind of stuff. Please leave comments down below with your thoughts on Vivi. As I mentioned, it was a really fun deck to play, so I suggest giving it a shot, but as I mentioned, maybe don't run headfirst into the first removal spell you see. Thank you all for watching this video, and I will catch you next time. Peace.